Yes.
I'm going to ask you questions that have come in about all sorts of different topics, so we're going to dot around a bit. Can I first start by bringing up ARCH 301478, and this is really the hair that I set running, and I just want to show you a document. It was in relation to whether or not those that had co-infections at stage 2 of hepatitis C, I should clarify, got 1 or 2 annual payments as announced by Mr. Andrew Lansley in January 2011. Here we have the first page of his announcement. If we go over to page 2, please. Down to the bottom of that page, 3 paragraphs up, those infected with both HIV and hepatitis C from NHS blood and blood products, contaminated blood will now receive 2 annual payments of $12,800 if they meet the stage 2 criteria, 1 payment for each infection along with the respective lump sums. So that was the evidence that you gave.
Yeah,
so just clarifying that you were correct about that, according to this document in any event. And the question that I've been asked to ask you arising from that is this. And you mentioned that you got advice about this. What about those with hepatitis C at stage 1? Is it not arbitrary not to give them the annual payment as well? Where co-infected.
Yes, yes. No, I don't believe it is, or it was an arbitrary decision at all. If that extra payment had been made to those co-infected with hepatitis C stage 1, I fail to see how we could have justified not giving it to those mono-infected with hepatitis C at stage 1. And the evidence didn't support that. So that's why the decision was made to only make it in respect of people who had hepatitis C at stage 2.
Even though there is a combined disadvantage in having both infections.
Yes, even though these. I think you can see, I hope you understand that the difficulties in trying to make these decisions. It's not a precise science, shall we say, but we were trying to be within the available funding. We were trying to be as fair as we could without introducing new anomalies into the system. And those who were co-infected and had hepatitis C stage 1, I mean, clearly, obviously, you don't want anyone to become more unwell than they are now or at that time. But if they had progressed, if they did progress to stage 2, then clearly, of course, they would receive that second payment.
This is in relation to the line, the departmental line on the difference between on Irish acceptance of liability, and that being the cause of the payments to those that were infected. I'm asked to ask you what the basis of your understanding and the departmental understanding was in relation to that.
As I remember, it was partly the pre-existing departmental briefing that we had, and there were also conversations, although I must admit I can't remember precisely at what point these occurred, but at some stage during our response to Lord Archer's report, we did have some conversations with colleagues in the Irish Republic, and those conversations appeared to confirm what we had understood to be the case. As you pointed out earlier on, Mr. Justice Holman clearly felt that we had got that wrong. So, but that was that, as far as I remember, was the basis of that understanding.
And I asked you some questions about whether you were aware that line to take that narrative was being challenged by campaigners, and I think you said that you couldn't remember that being the case.
No, I couldn't remember.
Can you remember, or were you aware that line was also being challenged in Parliament by MPs?
I remember questions being asked about it, certainly. In debates, I can't remember a specific parliamentary question, but I remember a discussion in debate, but I don't remember any specific challenge, as I'm afraid.
I asked you some questions about the accountability of Alliance House organisations to the Department of Health, and then I'm asked to ask this question in relation to devolved governments. Did the Alliance House organisations have any input from or accountability to devolved administrations, in particular the Skipton Fund and the Caxton Fund, which they part funded?
Yes, I'm quite sure the answer to that is yes. We had an agreement, I'm sorry, I'm just digging into the depths of my memory now. We had an agreement with the devolved administrations, certainly in respect of the Skipton Fund, which set out how we were going to interact with the devolved administrations, how they were going to interact with the Skipton Fund. I am trying to remember, I think there was something similar for Caxton Foundation as well, but I can't remember specifically, but obviously the paper may well be there.
Why was there no advance briefing, note or submission ready to respond to the Archer report, given that the department would presumably have been following the evidence and may have some idea about what may come out of it?
I think that's a perfectly reasonable question, but I'm afraid I don't know the answer.
I asked you some questions about...
Does that mean you would have expected them to have?
Not necessarily, but I mean, I certainly can understand the question. I think it's a perfectly reasonable question, but yes, I don't know the answer to that, I'm afraid.
I was asking you about the clearing process for submissions, and you were giving us some evidence in relation to that. And I think your evidence was, first of all, that it was a quality control role, and then I asked you a question about whether it could be a gatekeeping role, as in whether a submission should go up to a minister.
Yes.
And I'm asked to ask whether Ms. White did act as a gatekeeper in that regard, and whether you can recall ever being told that a matter should not go up to a minister, either by her or by another.
So in terms of submission clearance, yes, and I'm speaking generally now, there would have been a gatekeeping role, because generally we would discuss with senior colleagues when was appropriate to put a submission to ministers and sort of broadly what the content would be. So there was a gatekeeping role, but I don't ever remember an occasion when Dr. White said, no, you mustn't put a submission to ministers.
So I was asking you questions about parity between the schemes, the funding and the administration. Was consideration ever given to examining the disparity in eligibility? So we've been hearing evidence that the Macfarlane Trust and the Eileen Trust scheme, and I think you addressed this in your witness statement, had no cut-off date for eligibility, whereas the Skipton Fund had a cut-off date of 35 days from September 1991. So can you ever remember discussing that disparity?
No, sorry, 35 days from September 1991?
Yes.
I don't recollect that at all.
Where does that come from?
Sorry?
Where does that come from?
I think there is it's in the question. I can't remember the source of the, I can't remember the source of it, whether it's in the scheme or not. But I think Mr. Katowski was asked about it by Ms. Fraser-Button.
Yes, I think the scheme, as I recollect it, but please correct me if I'm wrong, says the 1st of September 1991.
So you may well be right.
I think there's certainly plainly an understanding that blood had a shelf life of 5 weeks, which was 35 days at that time, given the anticoagulants that were used. But I don't recall it being plus 35 days, and if it had been, one would have thought there would have been a date put in.
My recollection of this is somewhat hazy. I do remember it coming up in evidence with Mr. Katowski. It may be right that the scheme is is September 91. Quite what the what was said about the 35 days is in the question, yes, I can't take it much further.
It may simply be my misunderstanding, in which case I shall be delighted to be
I'm sure it isn't.
Which plainly I've slipped over.
So let me rephrase that, because I think that might have been slightly distracting, the 35 days. So that disparity of having a cut-off date in the Skipton Fund's eligibility criteria and no cut-off date in the McFarlane Trust and Eileen Trust. Can you recall whether there was discussion about that disparity and the reasons for it?
Not at all, I'm afraid, no.
And
I'm afraid, I don't even recollect there being a cut-off date in the Skipton Fund. But I obviously wasn't involved in drawing up the terms of reference for that fund, so I really don't know. I'm sorry, I can't help you.
Moving on then to questions about keeping the CMO up to date about VCJD. How did you keep him up to date with relevant scientific information? What was the process?
We would not necessarily send him directly, but probably send his private secretary notes of meetings for sort of general information. But if there was anything specific and important that came out of a meeting, then we would send briefing to CMO directly.
Did you or any other civil servants that you know of dealing with infected blood go to the House of Commons or Lords when infected blood was being debated or discussed?
Oh, yes.
Can you recall what your briefing was when you took over from Mr. Conan?
No, I can't.
Do you recall whether or not he gave you any information about the Haemophilia Society, for example?
I don't remember, and now this is not to say that he didn't provide me with written briefing. I don't remember any written briefing. We'd already been working together for some time, obviously on MSBTO related issues, so it may have been verbal briefing. I think I must have known something about the Haemophilia Society before Lord Archer reported, but probably not a great deal.
I was asking you about, at the beginning of the day, about how you went about educating yourself effectively when doing submissions, and I asked you about the self-sufficiency chronology, and you said that you would take that as read and work from there. I paraphrase. Were you aware that chronology was controversial, i.e. was not accepted as being materially complete or fair or accurate by a number of individuals and indeed by the Haemophilia Society?
I became aware. I don't know whether I was aware at the time that Lord Archer reported. I suspect I probably wasn't, but I know, I did become aware over time of that. And I certainly don't have any recollection of knowing that the Haemophilia Society specifically, thought it was controversial.
And are you able to tell us when or how you think you became aware of that?
I can't. I think it was progressive, probably. I can't tell you specifically when, but I imagine it was primarily in discussion with people, probably in terms of reading parliamentary proceedings and so on. All of those sorts of things, I think, would have contributed to my understanding that that was controversial.
And the next question builds on that. Was there a way of that kind of information, i.e. the fact that a key document is controversial, not accepted, has been challenged, question has been asked about it in debates or whatever, was there a way of capturing that in the official files so that for people like yourself going to that document to get information would be alerted to it?
I don't think there was any specific way of doing that, no. It probably would have required somebody to write a document actually sort of setting that out.
And then hope that they would be read together.
Yes, yes. I guess so.
Following the Archer report, the Department of Health committed to regular meetings with the Haemophilia Alliance, an existing forum comprising representatives from the Haemophilia Society, haemophilia doctors, and other professionals in haemophilia care.
Yep.
I'm asked to ask you whether or not you drafted the terms of reference for those meetings.
Oh, goodness. I may have contributed to them. I don't remember drafting them. I suspect one of my colleagues actually did the drafting, but I'm sure they would have been done in discussion, consultation with me and with Dr. White.
And are you able to help us as to why financial support was omitted from the terms of reference?
I think it was primarily to do with Lord Archer's recommendation. He had recommended a sort of statutory committee to advise on the care of, if I remember correctly, I'm not sure if I'm paraphrasing that right, care of people with haemophilia. And that's, I think, formed the basis of the terms of reference for the meetings with the Haemophilia Alliance. The other thing I would just point out is that discussions about financial support payments probably were not, as far as the Haemophilia Alliance is concerned, which were doctors, other clinical care staff, and the Haemophilia Society, they wouldn't all, I think, have been sort of directly involved in financial support discussions. So it didn't seem like the appropriate forum.
So those are the questions from call participants that I am going to ask. Stand behind them. Ms Gray has no questions.
Well, I have no questions either.
Dr. Jecock, is there anything you would wish to add?
May I just say something to the call participants, please? So I just wanted to say to you that I have met, obviously, a number of you over the years that I was in the department, and some of you, obviously, I got to know rather better as we dealt together on particular issues. And our relationships were tricky at times, both for me and for you, I know. But notwithstanding that, I just wanted to say to you how much I admire your determination and courage in never giving up your fight to have your voices heard. And I would like to say that I very much hope that the outcome of this inquiry does result in you being able to move on with your lives in the best possible way. So, thank you.
Well, from my part, thank you. You were someone that featured so much in some of the documents that we simply had to not only hear from you in writing, but see you in person. Thank you.
Thank you.
So tomorrow we hear from Alan Milburn.
Yes. So tomorrow, 10 o'clock, Alan Milburn.